Addo brought two nominees. My respected colleague, who was the acting chair, there was an advert that was placed in the papers, and they were given 10 days within which to appear. The NDC, led by Dr. Akuffo Addo, as minority leader, Honorable Kwame Abuja as minority chief whip, and the current majority leader, Honorable Mahama Ayariga, led the charge on behalf of the NDC. They opposed the vetting of the nominees. They physically prevented the vetting of the nominees. Their argument was that the 10 days was not enough, that the public must be given the opportunity to participate fully in the process. Therefore, we should suspend. Ladies and gentlemen, as Democrats as we are, then in majority, we listen to them.
All right, ebi sama me no wasana mo akwaba emfa mredu mediation asanso bebiu ensem ahoro a ekoso no ana ye de brew e wo hase no ensem de ekoso ma ekronkron gara masine ba no politics ya na chese he ya ana meso sa brebia wodi wani ebe kyerese bia bitimi ababenya ensem no enkyirimu ni pan yi ahanom ye nye bias bia ensem ne sidesiti na na me present e de kyew kama se bia bitimi ate ensem a ekoso no nyina ase pan yi ne sentina me saka this particular video upon live bia no sidesiti bia no meso so be kyew adwo comment section se woni yo ne adwen so ne nya adwen ma me bibia comment section honum e bi onso no one like video e de ma like ya e be ma bibia efefefe enso e wa hase na meso se wonya subscribe ya be subscribe ya ma so subscribe ya wi enso a on adom bi na subscribe ya ba ye no ai boso a bonse e be ma options bi all e be ba all but all ne so e fama me na bibia nso entimi enya kama next time me drop video a okura wo ha wo behwe YouTube for ebe ma notification be bia wo bia na wetimi enya nsem ne ebi eti ebusua kopem se besan so dey share say background bye.
In accordance with the NDC's own principal stand in 2024. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, for the records, in 2024, President Akuffo Addo brought two nominees. My respected colleague, who was the acting chair, there was an advert that was placed in the papers, and they were given 10 days within which to appear. The NDC, led by Dr. Akuffo Addo, as minority leader, Honorable Kwame Abuja as minority chief whip, and the current majority leader, Honorable Mahama Ayariga, led the charge on behalf of the NDC. They opposed the vetting of the nominees. They physically prevented the vetting of the nominees. Their argument was that the 10 days was not enough, that the public must be given the opportunity to participate fully in the process. Therefore, we should suspend. Ladies and gentlemen, as Democrats as we are, then in majority, we listened to them and we suspended the vetting to allow for the 14 days minimum notice in the public space. Thereafter, they participated in the vetting. Even after the process, they refused to participate in the final process of approval on the floor. We did not fight with them. Today, they are here claiming that just 3 days after announcement of nominees on the House floor, there must be vetting and approval. We do not accept. We see that the majority is trampling on the rules of the House.
The minority leader there, Afenyo Markin, saying the minority is kicking against the vetting of the judges of the Supreme Court nominees. They're clear. The standing orders, he code standing orders 217, 10 and 11, that stipulates the procedure with which an individual ought to be vetted before the committee. Well, let me take you to Parliament. Kweku Asante has been there for us all morning. Kweku, let's start with the vetting of the former majority leader, Mahama Ayariga. Some key things came up. Quite interesting was his position, really, for me, on the National Cathedral. Share with me the key highlights from Mahama Ayariga's vetting.
Faustina, that was the first question that, in fact, the form. Yes, that's the first question that the majority leader was asked, the question about the National Cathedral, and he said that the cathedral idea was not really a bad idea, but how it was executed. And that if he gets the sense that the Ghanaian people want it and the president wants it, then he will mobilize funds for it. It was quite a revealing response, given what we've heard from the NDC when it comes to the National Cathedral, particularly the very tough remark from Samuel Okudzeto-Ablakwa, the president himself, and the rank and file of the party, who have described it as a terrible project which public funds ought not be used for. However, Mahama Ayarga's point was a bit tricky because it appeared he was very calculated in the responses he gave. First, he hinges any continuation of that project on public acceptance or public approval, one, and also two, the president's approval. And we know a little bit about the president's position on this National Cathedral project. But then he also says he will mobilize funds for it. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean mobilizing funds or resources from the public purse, or doing so from private persons? It is something that we expected that the committee would have probed a bit further to get some answers on, but not a lot of probing was done over there on that issue, and then it moved on. He's also been addressing whether or not he will be fair in chieftaincy disputes. And for those who are uninitiated, Mahama Ayarga is MP for Boko Central, and Boko has been at the center of attention for decades, that conflict between Kusasis and Mamprusis, and now you have a Kusasi being appointed a minister to be in charge of chieftaincy matters. The minority leader who asked the question specifically spoke about a petition that he had received from the Mamprusi leader, àńgŕý, on whether or not the minority leader can actually be fair about matters having to do with that chieftaincy conflict. Mahama Ayarga says his own mother is a Mamprusi, and so he considers himself a son of Mamprusi and will continue to be firm and fair on that matter, neutral, and will not interfere in the chieftaincy issues there. There's also the very vexed matter having to do with property rates. Successive governments have been trying and failing to collect the billions of cedis and dollars that can accrue from property rates. Mahama Ayarga says when he gets the approval of Parliament, he's going to work on a concept that will ensure that the district assemblies, MMDAs, are able to collect this revenue and use it for national purposes. It goes on to cite a lot of jurisdiction and how they've been able to do it. And then finally, I think one of the most important points he addressed is the question about electing MMDCs. You will recall that recently the government has put out its position paper on electing MMDCs. You will recall again that under President Akuffo Addo, the constitution was to be amended for partisan elections to be introduced at a district level. At the time, the NDC walked away from that process because they said that they did not want partisanship at the local level, and so that referendum was botched. Since this government came into power, they've initiated the constitution review process, and that review process recommended that MMDCs be elected on partisan basis, but the government did not accept that, and has instead recommended the president appointing 5 people. There'll be a vetting to shortlist them to 3, and then the people in the various localities will then vote for that 3. Mahama Ayarga has been explaining it in terms of how executive power will be vested and why he thinks perhaps this is the best process to go. So Mahama Ayarga's vetting was largely event-free. He is a leader. In fact, he was asked more questions than we expected, because when you look at the way Parliament conducts itself when it comes to leaders, they ask very few questions of leaders, and then he had to make his way. So that is the lowdown as it relates to Mahama Ayarga.
And I'm interested in the vetting of Dr. Zenatu Agyemang-Rawlings as well. She's been vetted for the position of Environment, Science and Technology Minister. Some key things she said that really stood out for me were her thoughts on the ban of styrofoam, which is mostly known as takeaway packs, but also on illegal mining, which is very controversial. But you can walk us through the key highlights as well.
Yes, the Environment Minister also got that first question on styrofoam and how she intends to protect the environment. Already EPA has initiated the process to ban styrofoam by the start of 2027. This is a position as incoming sector minister. If he gets the nod of Parliament, he she actually seems to fully agree with and says that is one of the surest way. And she has a proposition of how to replace plastics and materials like styrofoam. She talks about how using natural elements like cassava and plantain and other things, you'll be able to come up with more environmentally friendly packages for food and all sort of things. And so she says that is going to be very substantial in how she would deliver on the mandate as Minister for Environment when she gets the nod. But of course, the big question that she had to deal with at the vetting today was illegal mining. And illegal mining has become such a scourge. Both political parties agree on the scale of illegal mining and what must be done to deal with it. And she is clear that she's going to work with the security agencies. She's going to declare like a zero tolerance for illegal mining, Galamsey, because she agrees with a lot of people who make the point that illegal mining is completely destroying our environment, and if it's allowed to continue going on, it will destroy the environment. And so, again, those were the most important aspects of the questioning that came to Zaneto Agyemang-Rawlings. Doctor, she received questions also about NDC's nationally determined contributions in terms of the environment, climate change, and all of that. And you got the sense that she seems like she's very much on top of the brief. She also did not spend a lot of time because, in fact, usually the minority leader would have asked a lot of questions, but he had just stepped out, and then she was discharged before he walked in, and he didn't protest and asked to ask those questions and all of that. So Senator Agyemang-Rawlings also asked and answered questions and then left, and then the controversial issues then began. Faustina.
Controversial issues. Even before we wrap up with Zanato, one key proposal she made, which is quite interesting, which we could explore further moving forward, is a proposal that EPA should institute sports checks, especially at the ports and at illegal mining sites and even at mining sites to ensure that miners are using the right chemicals. But I'm interested in what transpired, the minority's push to ensure that 3 nominees of the Supreme Court are not vetted today. They cited key provisions in the standing orders, Order 217, I beg your pardon, 10 and 11, key provisions, and it appears they had a point. Walk me through what transpired.
Yes, in fact, this morning at about 9:30, just before the vetting itself would start, the minority leader address press conference, you've played part of the inserts from Afenyo Markin's earlier press conference, where he raises issue. Usually, when the Speaker of Parliament refers appointments or nominees to the appointment committee, what happens is the nominations are advertised for 14 days at least, so that the public will send in memoranda. It also gives in MPs to do their own background checks, national security will conduct their own background check and all of that. But because this was emergency, all that was not done. The minority's contention was that, one, and most importantly, the standing orders and the rules, the strict rules, were not suspended to make room for the vetting to happen within the same week as the referral was made. But then it was a bit tricky because the president has nominated 5 people, 2 people for ministerial nominees and 3 for Supreme Court. None of them have had their appointments published for memoranda to be received. But the minority had said that they did not have any problem actually vetting those 2 ministerial nominees, and they vetted them without raising an issue. But when it came to the Supreme Court nominees, they really had issues. It appears to me, and for somebody that's been paying attention, looking around, that this was the minority's way of paying back the NDC for what they did in 2024. And for those who recall, in 2024, President Akuffo Addo nominated 2 persons to go to the Supreme Court. The NDC resisted that. In fact, part of the reason why they said they were not going to allow those nominations to go through was that the memoranda had not been published for 14 days. It had been published for just 10 days. And I was in the committee room that day. It nearly degenerated into fisticuffs when the minority, at the time, the NDC said they were not going to allow the vetting to happen. Surprisingly and coincidentally, one of the persons that John Mahama has now nominated, in the person of Justice Sophia Rosetta Isabenasco, was part of those Akuffo Addo had nominated at the time. And she was sitting there while MPs haggled, fought, shouted over each other. But eventually they vetted her. But she never got the approval because the NDC insisted that Akuffo Addo was a lame duck president and had to exit for the next president to come and appoint judges. So the minority said they were not going to allow that. And that because the standing orders had not been suspended on the floor, they were not going to allow that. It led to some back and forth between the minority leader and the chairman of the committee, Bernard Ahiafo. Because when Afenyo Markin made those points, the first deputy speaker who chairs the committee made a ruling overruling the preliminary objection that Afenyo had made. But Afenyo Markin came back and said that his point was not an objection, strictly speaking, that required a ruling from the speaker, and that his idea was that it should have been open for a debate on the floor of the committee, and then a vote taken before any decision could be taken, and that the speaker's ruling was a misnomer. Then Mahama Yariga, who had just been vetted and had left, actually came in again and actually explained some things, and I was on the floor. The day the Speaker of Parliament made a referral, the appointment committee presented a report and detailed how the vetting was supposed to happen. And in the appointment committee report, they recommended to the House a suspension of the rules. The House did not vote specifically on suspending the rules, but they voted on the appointment committee, the business committee's report, which included a recommendation to suspend the rules. So according to the Speaker and the First Deputy Speaker, that had been done. But also quite importantly, on the floor, the Majority Chief Whip, Roxy Nelson Dafiamepo, had wanted to move a motion to suspend the rules, but the Speaker of Parliament said that was not necessary. This was an emergency meeting, and that everything had to be dealt with as an emergency and in the kind of urgent way that was required. So back and forth, the minority obviously knowing that they're not going to get their way, but they had made their say, walked out, and so Afenyo Markin led his colleagues on the committee to walk out. And so the first judge, Justice Edward Asante, has been vetted without the minority's participation. There are 2 more nominees to be vetted. At 3 o'clock, which is just about 2 minutes away, we expect that the second nominee will take her seat, and then the third will also do it. We expect that by 4 or 5 p.m., the vetting will have ended because the minority are not around, which will usually mean the process will go on a bit speedily, and then all of that will be done before Parliament will come and sit. We expect that the report will be laid on the floor today, and then early tomorrow morning, or perhaps even this evening, they may debate it and vote on it. That is all up to Parliament to decide. But this vetting, as always, has not been without a controversial moment. Faustina.
Indeed, and I'm interested in the vetting of Edward Asante. Some of the key things that have come up during his vetting, the use of artificial intelligence in the whole judiciary architecture, and the concerns that AI could take the jobs of lawyers. Walk us through some of the key highlights from that vetting.
Well, at the risk of getting some trouble from the judges, usually judges are old heads and are very slow to change. Artificial intelligence is now in vogue around the world, but a lot of people are very skeptical about how they go in there. When it comes to the judiciary in particular, they are even much more skeptical. But Justice Edward Asante does not appear to have a problem with artificial intelligence, because he talks about how, as president of the ECOWAS court holding in Nigeria, he introduced artificial intelligence into proceedings where resources are fed into the artificial intelligence to allow judges expeditiously deal with matters. And so judges can just feed resources into the artificial intelligence and then come out with a ruling. And so he talks about how he believes that is something that must be done. Then there's also the question about lawyers' freedom of choice, whether they can join associations, they can form their own. There's this ongoing debate and ongoing dispute as to whether or not the General Legal Council should even license splinter groups from the Ghana Bar Association on the back of the formation of the Ghana Law Society and all of that. And so Afenyo Markin, who is the acting president of the Ghana Law Society, asked him a question about whether or not judges and lawyers in particular are free to choose and join associations of their choice. Justice Asante almost made his opinion heard on that, started that, lawyers have the chance to be free to choose where they want to be. However, the Chief Justice immediately, sitting behind him, got up, tapped him, spoke to him and said, there is actually a case before the Supreme Court now, but we haven't decided. It's possible when you come onto the court, we may empanel you to go and hear that matter. And so your opinion cannot be made public. And then he held back and said he's unable to do that. So he's also been talking about some of these important issues before the courts.
And Kweku, we're expecting 2 more individuals to be vetted today. Who are they, and how long will the process roughly take before they commence?
Justice Rosetta Sabenasco is a Court of Appeal judge. She's a very senior judge. Like I said early on, she's one of the judges Akuffo Addo, President Akuffo Addo, appointed in 2024. And she was vetted, but she didn't get a note. It was not like she was rejected, but the House was unable to take a decision because the minority, the NDC then insisted that the appointment be left for the next president to come and fill those vacancies. And so she's expected to come next before Anthony Forson. And Anthony Forson is the former president of the Ghana Bar Association. So those two persons will come in. But because the minority side have walked away from the proceedings, usually the majority side, whose president has made the nominations, ask a few questions and the process unravels. So if the speaker's word, the first deputy speaker's word is anything to go by, they should have been in their chairs by now, but we understand they still not resumed because it's just past 3 now. That is the point of break, and that is what the speaker, the first deputy speaker said the committee will be resuming, and they haven't resumed. So when they do resume now, those two persons will come before the committee to be vetted, and we don't expect that it will take a long time. If Justice Asante's timing, which was just a little over an hour, is anything to go by. But even that hour was mainly because of Afenyo Markin and the objections he raised are anything to go by. Then the process, I expect that by 5:30 or by 6, perhaps considerably less, this process would have ended.
Some interesting parts that we didn't get to talk about really was during the vetting of Edward Asante. I saw the likes of Frank Davis behind him. Your thoughts about that, the undertone of that unity between different individuals from different political divides all coming together under one umbrella?
Yeah, I mean, we usually see this when it comes to judges because judges are supposed to be apolitical. And someone like Frank Davis is a very senior lawyer. He's been practicing before the courts for years. So it's very obvious he may have practiced before Justice Edward Asante when he was in the High Court, in the Court of Appeal, or have some close relationships and all of that. And so when it comes to appointment of judges, usually people from all shades usually come in there to support them, particularly because of their jurisprudence, how they know them, and all of that. Justice Asante is also, I mean, if you look at the record of his on the court, Justice Tokonu, who has been removed as